If you crave the truth buried beneath prison walls, if you're drawn to the stories that make your pulse spike and your skin crawl, hit subscribe, like this video, and drop a comment below. Because tonight's case will drag you straight into the darkest corners of California's coast, where even a locked cell can't keep the truth contained. The body in the fog. The sirens cut through the coastal fog just after 4:17 a.m. Blue and red lights smeared across the damp pavement of the Pacific Coast Highway outside Santa Cruz, reflecting off the ocean like fractured neon. A fisherman had made the call. He'd been setting up before sunrise when he spotted something tangled in the rocks below the cliffs. At first, he thought it was driftwood. Then he saw the hand. By the time deputies from the Santa Cruz County Sheriff's Office scrambled down the embankment, the tide was already shifting. The body was wedged between two jagged boulders, soaked and lifeless, dressed in standard-issue prison denim. There was no wallet, no phone, no shoes, but there was a number stitched onto the fabric. Inmate number 44721. Within hours, the name attached to that number would rattle the California Department of Corrections. Daniel Reyes, 34 years old, serving a 12-year sentence at Soledad State Prison for armed robbery and aggravated assault. He had 6 more years before parole eligibility. According to prison logs, Reyes had been accounted for during evening lockdown the night before, but he wasn't in his cell at morning roll call. He was dead on the rocks, 70 miles away. Detective Laura Bennett stood at the edge of the cliff, wind whipping her dark hair across her face as she studied the recovery operation below. A 15-year veteran with a reputation for dissecting lies, Bennett didn't believe in coincidences. "Transport van?" she asked. Her partner, Detective Mark Halpern, shook his head. No scheduled transfers. No court dates. No medical runs. Bennett stared out at the ocean. So either someone signed him out off the books, or he walked out of a maximum security prison. Halpern exhaled slowly. And ended up here? The autopsy later that afternoon delivered the first shock. Reyes hadn't drowned. He'd been dead before he hit the water. Blunt force trauma to the back of the skull. A single, deliberate strike. No defensive wounds. No hesitation marks. Whoever hit him knew exactly where to land the blow. The coroner estimated time of death between midnight and 2 a.m. That narrowed the window. Back at Soledad State Prison, tension hung thick in the air. Warden Thomas Green insisted there had been no breach. "Impossible," he said flatly, seated behind his desk beneath the American flag. "We run triple counts. Cameras in every corridor. Armed towers." Bennett's gaze lingered on a bank of security monitors lining the wall. Then how did an inmate end up dead on the Pacific coast? Green's jaw tightened. "We're reviewing footage." But when prison IT staff pulled a recording from Reyes' housing unit, something didn't add up. Between 11:42 p.m. and 2:06 a.m., the feed from Corridor C went black. Not static, not glitching, just black. The official explanation was a temporary systems failure, a software update gone wrong. Bennett wasn't buying it. She requested Reyes' file. What she found painted a more complicated picture than a simple robbery conviction. Before his arrest, Daniel Reyes had been a dock worker in Monterey. No gang affiliations. No prior felonies. Friends described him as quiet, protective of his younger sister, Elena. But buried deep in the file was something else. 6 months before his death, Reyes had filed multiple formal complaints inside the prison. Allegations of contraband smuggling. Claims that certain correctional officers were facilitating drug distribution between rival inmate groups. The complaints went nowhere. 2 were marked unsubstantiated. 1 was labeled disciplinary manipulation, and 1 was mysteriously withdrawn. Bennett drove to a modest duplex in Monterey to speak with Elena Reyes. The woman who answered the door looked like she hadn't slept in days. "They told me he tried to escape," Elena whispered, eyes red. "They said he must have gotten help from someone outside." Bennett watched her carefully. "Did your brother ever talk about trouble inside?" Elena hesitated, then nodded. "He said he'd seen things. Deals. Guards looking the other way. He said if he reported it, he'd be dead." Halpern leaned forward. "Did he mention names?" Elena's hands trembled. He wrote them down. He said if anything happened to him, I should take the envelope to a lawyer. The room seemed to shrink. Where is it? Bennett asked. Elena walked to a hallway closet and pulled down a small metal lockbox. Inside was a sealed manila envelope. Bennett broke the seal. Inside was a handwritten list of names. 3 inmates, 2 correctional officers, and one name that made her pulse spike. Lieutenant Arthur Kessler, a decorated 20-year veteran of Soledad, head of internal security. The same man who had signed off on the system's failure. Report the night Reyes disappeared. Halpern exhaled sharply. That's not small-time corruption. Bennett flipped the page over. On the back, Reyes had written one more line. They're moving something bigger than drugs. Below it was a date. Tonight, Bennett checked her watch. It was already past 9:30 p.m., and when she called Soledad to request immediate access to Lieutenant Kessler, she was told he had just left the facility. On emergency leave. No forwarding address. No explanation. But as Bennett stared at the list of names in her hand, she realized something far more chilling. Daniel Reyes hadn't been trying to escape prison. He had been trying to expose it. And someone inside those walls had made sure he never would. But when investigators finally pulled external traffic camera footage from a rural service road behind the prison, they spotted a prison transport vehicle leaving at 12:14 a.m., with its GPS tracker manually disabled, and in the passenger seat, barely visible through the windshield, was a figure wearing a lieutenant's uniform. What they uncovered next would prove that Daniel Reyes wasn't just a prisoner of the state. He was a liability, and someone was willing to kill to keep him silent. The transport in the dark. By sunrise, the quiet cliffs outside Santa Cruz were crawling with investigators. Detective Laura Bennett stood over a blown-up still frame from the rural traffic camera. The prison transport van was unmistakable. White body, state seal on the door, unit number partially obscured by fog. The timestamp read 12:14 a.m. The GPS unit had been manually disabled 3 minutes earlier. That's not a glitch, Halpern muttered. That's intent. The van had exited through a secondary service road, rarely used except for maintenance deliveries. According to official logs at Soledad State Prison, no vehicles had departed the facility overnight. Yet the footage didn't lie. The next problem was harder, proving who was inside. Lieutenant Arthur Kessler had not reported for duty that morning. His phone went straight to voicemail. His state-issued SUV was missing from the staff lot. Payroll confirmed he had logged overtime hours the night Reyes disappeared. Pull his financials, Bennett ordered. Bank transfers, credit cards, anything unusual in the last 6 months. Within hours, a financial analyst from the state task force flagged something that shifted the case from suspicious to explosive. Kessler had received 4 wire transfers over the past year, totaling nearly $240,000. The source? A shell corporation registered in Nevada. The corporation's listed business purpose: Coastal Logistics Consulting. There was no website, no employees, no tax filings beyond minimal annual paperwork. But when investigators traced a mailing address, it led to a rented office suite in downtown San Jose, vacant for nearly 2 years. Money for what? Halpern asked. Bennett didn't answer immediately. She was staring at the list Daniel Reyes had left behind. They're moving something bigger than drugs. If this was about contraband inside the prison, phones, narcotics, tobacco, it didn't justify $250,000 wire transfers. This was infrastructure-level corruption. Bennett contacted the regional office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Within hours, the case shifted from a county homicide to a joint federal investigation. By mid-afternoon, agents were interviewing inmates from Corridor C. Most refused to talk, until one did. Inmate Marcus read, Holloway had nothing left to lose. Serving life without parole, Holloway had watched prison politics evolve for 2 decades. They weren't just moving drugs, he told Bennett through reinforced glass in the interview room. They were moving people. Bennett held his gaze. Explain. Holloway leaned closer, lowering his voice. Temporary releases. Ghost transports. Guys who were supposed to be locked down showing up on the outside for a night, doing jobs. then brought back before morning count. Halpern frowned. That's impossible. Every movement is logged. Holloway gave a humorless smile. Logged by who? He didn't have names. But he confirmed one thing. Reyes had been asking questions. Too many. He figured it out, Holloway said. He saw one of the vans come back with mud on the tires and no paperwork. After that, he kept notes. Said he was going to the feds. The interview ended with one chilling detail. 3 nights ago, Holloway added, Reyes told me if anything happened to him, it wouldn't look like an accident. Back in the evidence lab, forensic techs made another discovery. Under Reyes' fingernails were microscopic flecks of dark blue paint, the same shade used exclusively on internal transport vehicle partitions at Soledad. That meant Reyes had been inside the van before he died, voluntarily or not. Then came the second shock. Highway toll records captured the transport van's license plate entering a private marina in Half Moon Bay at 1:03 a.m. Security footage from the marina showed the van parked near a 40-foot fishing trawler named Pacific Mercy. Registered owner, Coastal Logistics Consulting, the shell company. Inside the marina office, agents reviewed dock camera footage. At 1:22 a.m., 2 figures dragged what appeared to be a human form toward the edge of the pier. The resolution was grainy, faces indistinguishable, but one detail stood out. The taller figure moved with a distinct limp. When Bennett pulled Kessler's personnel file, she found a note from a knee surgery 2 years prior. Ligament damage from a training accident. Recovery, partial. Permanent gait alteration. By nightfall, a warrant was issued for Arthur Kessler's arrest. But when a tactical team entered his home in a quiet subdivision near Salinas, they found it empty, drawers cleared, hard drives removed, family photographs gone. On the kitchen counter sat a single sheet of paper, typed, no signature. You're looking in the wrong direction. Bennett read it twice, then 3 times. She turned to Halpern. He wants us focused on him. You think he's a distraction? Before she could answer, her phone rang. It was the medical examiner. There's something else, the coroner said. We re-examined a wound on Reyes' skull. Bennett felt her pulse quicken. And it wasn't a standard batten or blunt object. The fracture pattern is consistent with marine-grade deck cleat. Heavy, fixed metal, like the ones bolted to boat docks. Bennett closed her eyes briefly. Reyes hadn't been killed inside the prison. He'd been transported alive, taken to the marina, and executed on the pier, which meant this wasn't a panic decision. It was planned, coordinated, and larger than one corrupt lieutenant. As FBI agents prepared to seize the Pacific Mercy, they received another alert. A second prison transport vehicle, different unit number, had just been logged leaving Soledad after midnight. No paperwork, no authorization, and this time, the GPS tracker wasn't disabled. It was transmitting live, heading north, towards San Francisco. Bennett stared at the moving dot on the digital map. Get me every available unit, she said, because if Holloway was telling the truth, Daniel Reyes hadn't been the only inmate taken out that night, and someone else was about to disappear. The web tightens. The GPS signal pulsed steadily on the screen inside the mobile command unit. Northbound, Highway 101. Speed, 63 miles per hour. Destination, unknown. Detective Laura Bennett felt a familiar tightening in her chest, the sensation that time was no longer moving forward but collapsing inward. If Marcus Holloway had been right, another inmate was being moved off the books. And if Daniel Reyes had been silenced for discovering it, whoever was in that van was in immediate danger. California Highway Patrol units closed in from the south, while unmarked SUVs positioned ahead near the outskirts of San Francisco. The van's signal exited the freeway near an industrial corridor not far from the waterfront. Warehouses, shipping containers, private docks, the Pacific Coast underbelly. Units in position. Came the radio confirmation. The van rolled through a chain-link gate into a dimly lit storage facility. The sign outside read, Bayline Seafood Distribution. Registered owner, Coastal Logistics Consulting. Bennett didn't wait for a full perimeter. She moved with the entry team as the gate was breached. The van's engine was still running when they stormed the loading bay. 2 correctional officers stood frozen beside the open rear doors. Neither was Lieutenant Kessler. Inside the van, shackled to a bench, was inmate Christopher Vale, 41, serving 8 years for financial fraud. No history of violence. He looked terrified. They said it was a transfer. Vale stammered as agents cut his restraints. Midnight reclassification. I didn't do anything. The 2 officers were detained immediately. Both claimed they were following direct orders from internal security. Signed by Kessler. But Kessler's name was the only thing about the paperwork that appeared legitimate. The digital authorization codes were fabricated. The transport logs had been manually overridden. Inside the warehouse, agents found something that reframed the entire investigation. It wasn't drugs. It wasn't weapons. It was computers. Rows of high-end servers humming inside climate control racks. Industrial Wi-Fi boosters. Encrypted satellite uplinks. An entire cyber operation hidden behind crates labeled frozen tuna. Forensic technicians began imaging drives on site. Within hours, the FBI Cyber Division confirmed what Reyes had stumbled onto. The prison wasn't being used to smuggle narcotics. It was being used to smuggle expertise. Select inmates with backgrounds in finance, coding, and logistics were being temporarily removed from custody to run high-level cyber fraud operations. Identity theft, corporate ransomware, cryptocurrency laundering, crimes executed from inside a warehouse, but routed through overseas proxy servers to appear international. The brilliance of the scheme was chilling. If the operation was ever exposed, the criminals on paper were already behind bars. Untraceable, disposable. Daniel Reyes hadn't been part of it. He'd been in the wrong corridor at the wrong time, and he'd started asking questions. But the biggest shock came from a recovered encrypted drive labeled Phase 3. When analysts cracked it, they found payment ledgers. The $240,000 wired to Arthur Kessler was only a fraction of the money moving through coastal logistics. Millions of dollars had flowed through accounts tied to offshore entities. And among the recipients was a name no one expected. Warden Thomas Green, the man who had insisted the prison systems were flawless. The man who had dismissed Reyes' complaints. His payments were structured as consulting bonuses. Bennett felt a cold wave settle over her. This wasn't corruption in the shadows. It was institutional. By dawn, federal agents executed a warrant at Green's residence. He didn't resist. He didn't even deny it. They were nonviolent offenders. Green said quietly during interrogation, white-collar criminals. No blood on their hands. We leverage their skills. You leverage inmates for organized cybercrime, Bennett replied. Green's expression hardened. The state underfunds corrections. Do you know how much it costs to run a facility like Soledad? This operation kept programs alive, kept staff employed. And Daniel Reyes? Bennett asked. Green looked away. He became a risk. But there was still one missing piece. Arthur Kessler. 3 days later, a fisherman off the coast near Monterey radioed in about a small vessel drifting without power. It was the Pacific Mercy. Inside the cabin, investigators found Kessler, dead. Single gunshot wound to the chest. No weapon recovered. The official conclusion was internal betrayal. Someone higher in the financial chain eliminating loose ends. But no arrest followed. The offshore accounts went dark. Coastal logistics dissolved overnight. In the weeks that followed, Warden Green and 6 correctional officers were indicted on federal charges. 2 inmates admitted participating in the cyber operations in exchange for reduced sentences. Christopher Vale entered witness protection. Marcus Holloway was transferred out of state. And Daniel Reyes was buried in Monterey beneath a gray sky that mirrored the ocean where his body had been found. At the small graveside service, Elena Reyes stood beside Detective Bennett. They called him a criminal, Elena whispered, but he was trying to do the right thing. Bennett nodded. Sometimes the truth costs everything. The case was declared closed, officially, but 3 months later, in a financial crimes task force briefing in Washington, analysts flagged a familiar pattern. Ransomware attacks routed through proxy servers identical to the architecture seized in San Francisco. The digital signature was precise. Too precise. Someone had rebuilt the system. And when Bennett received the internal memo, one detail made her blood run cold. The encrypted tag embedded in the new malware strain contained a 2-letter marker. AR. Arthur Kessler's initials. But Kessler was dead. At least, that's what the report said. No weapon. No witnesses. No confirmed time of death. Just a body on a drifting boat. As the Pacific fog rolled once more across the California coast, one question refused to fade. Had Daniel Reyes uncovered a prison corruption scheme? Or had he stumbled into something far more powerful, still operating beneath the surface? They thought the architect was buried at sea. But somewhere in the network, the code was still alive. If you think this case was intense, you're not ready for the next one. Subscribe so you don't miss what's coming.